Suitcases were still thudding down the front steps when I realized something was wrong. Not dramatic, not loud, just wrong in the way the air shifts right before a storm breaks. Cassandra, my sister, brushed past me with a breezy smile that did not reach her eyes. Gregory, my brother-in-law, called out something about sunscreen, and neither of them looked at me long enough to register that I was a person and not another lamp in their Evanston living room. I had played this role before, the dependable sister, the quiet placeholder, the one who stayed behind while other people flew off to Hawaii. Leela, my niece, stood near the stairs clutching the banister, her shoulders tight, her eyes fixed somewhere past both of us. She had not spoken in almost 2 months. Not since the accident that split her world open. Cassandra talked about it like it was a phase, the way she talked about everything that scared her. A phase. A mood, a small inconvenience that she would iron out with enough charm and a few, well-worded reassurances. But the quiet inside Lila felt different. Heavy, intentional. The kind of silence that grows roots. The front door shut behind Cassandra and Gregory, and I heard the lock turn. It was the soft, automatic kind of turn that usually meant safety, but this time it sent something cold traveling up my spine. They called goodbye over their shoulders without waiting for an answer. I watched their car reverse down the driveway, sunlight flashing on the windshield as if mocking me for thinking this would be an ordinary 3-day babysitting favor. The house settled into stillness. Then Leela spoke. "Auntie, do not touch the food they left for you." For a moment, I did not move. Her voice was soft and raspy, like it had been waiting inside her chest too long. I had not heard it since well before the accident. Hearing it now felt like watching a door open by itself. I crouched in front of her. "Lila, what did you say?" Her eyes darted toward the kitchen. Her fingers twisted into the hem of her shirt. She whispered again, barely audible. "Do not eat it." A child does not break 2 months of silence for something small. Something had been placed in that refrigerator with purpose, with expectation. And suddenly, I could not remember the last time Cassandra had asked about my health, or my life, or anything that did not benefit her directly. Before I go any further, let me pause for a moment. I always like knowing what people are doing while they listen to stories like this. It makes the world feel a little closer, a little less cold. So if you feel like it, share it in the comments later. When all of this happened, I was standing in that kitchen doorway watching the air shift around my niece as if the truth she carried was heavier than her small body could hold. I stood slowly and walked into the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed in the corner, steady and familiar. Too familiar. I opened the door and felt the cool air circle my face. Inside, every shelf was lined with containers and plates wrapped tightly in plastic. Meals prepared in advance. Casseroles. Cut fruit. Soup. A covered bowl with my name written on a piece of tape. Cassandra never prepared my meals, not even when I came over to help her with the kids for an entire weekend. She barely remembered I was allergic to shellfish. She once served me shrimp and insisted the hives were just my imagination. Something sharp settled in my chest as I stood there. It was not fear. Fear comes with confusion and denial. This was clarity. Cold, precise clarity that tasted like understanding something I should have seen long ago. Lila stood in the doorway, her hands tucked under her arms as if holding herself together. I asked her gently, why should I not eat it? Her eyes filled, not with tears, but with the kind of dread children learn only when adults teach it to them. She whispered, "They said you would get sick while they were gone. They said 3 days is enough." 3 days. The exact length of their vacation. The exact length of time they told me I would be watching Lila. The exact window during which no one would check on me. The exact window before Cassandra would come back and, by law, inherit the house my parents left to me. The house in Skokie I had not moved into yet, because grief comes in layers and some. Houses carry ghosts before you are ready to face them. I asked her again, softer this time. "What do you mean sick?" She pressed her face into her sleeve. "They said you would not know. They said it would just happen." My breath went thin. My hands felt strange, like they belonged to someone else. I closed the refrigerator door with a quiet click and leaned against the counter for balance. There are moments in life when all the noise falls away and the truth shows itself in plain form. This was one of them. My sister, my own sister, had left food in her refrigerator with the expectation that I would eat it. She had locked her door behind her. She had left her child in my care and assumed I would not be alive when she returned. I looked at Lila again, this small girl who had swallowed 2 months of silence until the moment she believed speaking could save me. Her hair fell over her cheek in a way that reminded me of how she looked at age 4 when she asked me to braid it like mine. She had always trusted me. She still did. I knelt in front of her and tucked a strand behind her ear. "Thank you for telling me. You did the right thing." Her lip trembled, but she nodded. I led Lila away from the kitchen and into the living room, keeping my voice steady even though my thoughts were running in sharp, fast lines. She climbed onto the couch and pulled her knees to her chest. I sat beside her, not touching her yet, waiting for the room to settle around us. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background, a reminder of the danger sitting behind its door. My danger, placed there by people who had hugged me only an hour earlier. Lila watched me with wide eyes, waiting for something I had not yet said. Children look for cues in moments like this. They scan your face to decide whether to panic. I did not let mine move. I told her we were going to be careful. I told her she was safe with me. I told her I believed her. That last part made her exhale, a slow breath that sounded like she had been holding it inside her tiny body for far too long. I asked her gently if she wanted to stay near me while I checked a few things around the house. She nodded right away, slipping off the couch and trailing behind me as I walked through each room, new eyes. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked violent or rushed. And yet the whole house felt rearranged, as if every ordinary object had been placed there to hide the extraordinary truth sitting beneath it. In the guest room where I usually slept, the bed was neatly made and a folded towel sat at the foot of it. Cassandra had never left towels for me before. She barely washed the ones she had. The gesture felt like another prop in a scene she had built. Something to make me comfortable enough not to question a thing. I checked the nightstand. An herbal tea packet labeled for sleep had been placed there. Another new behavior. I stared at it until my hands prickled. Then I carefully set it aside and walked out. Back in the hallway, Lila slipped her hand into mine. Her palm was warm and damp. She whispered, "Can we go soon?" I asked her if she was scared. She shook her head, but her chin trembled, and that was enough of an answer. I guided her upstairs next, partly to keep her near me, partly because I knew I needed to see something for myself. Her bedroom door was half open. The last time I visited, pink posters covered the walls, and tiny socks littered the floor. Now the room felt too tidy, as if she no longer lived in it, but visited it the way you visit a memory. She stood quietly beside me while I looked around. Her backpack sat by the dresser. I asked if she wanted to take it when we left. She nodded again, more firmly this time. She walked toward it, picked it up, hugged it to her chest, then returned to my side. We went to the master bedroom last. The bed unmade, clothes on the chair, drawers slightly open, as if Cassandra had rushed packing for Hawaii. Normal signs of a family in a hurry. Except there was nothing normal about anything anymore. I stood there long enough to feel the weight of what had almost happened. 3 days. That was what Cassandra told me the stay would be. That was what she told Lila. 3 days was how long they needed me to keep eating their food before the symptoms would start. How many days before a coroner would find a quiet cause of death? How many days before my house in Skokie shifted into Cassandra's hands because grief was a convenient veil to hide behind? I felt the betrayal settle into me like cold air. Not sharp, not loud, but as steady as truth. I turned toward Lila. "We are leaving now." She nodded without hesitation. We walked downstairs together. I grabbed my bag, packed only with what I had brought that morning. I did not take food or gifts or anything that tied me to Cassandra's life. I did not need reminders of what she had tried to do. At the door, I paused. The lock clicked beneath my hand again. The same sound as earlier, except now, it did not sound domestic. It sounded like the final mark on a choice someone had made about whether I lived or died. Outside, the air felt cooler, cleaner. I buckled Lila into the backseat of my car, her small fingers gripping her backpack like a lifeline. She watched the house through the window while I settled into the driver's seat. I was not sure what she was waiting for. Maybe a sign that someone inside cared enough to notice us leaving. No one did. We drove in silence at first. The streets of Evanston were familiar, but tonight they felt like something I needed to pass through quickly. Streetlights pooled yellow light on the pavement. A couple walked their dog across the corner. A teenager rode past on a bike. Ordinary life moving on as if nothing inside that house had been poisoning itself. From the inside out. Halfway to the motel, Lila whispered, "Will they be mad?" Her voice was so small it barely reached the front seat. I answered right away, no hesitation. "You did the bravest thing you could have done. I want you to hear me. You saved me." She blinked fast, her eyes shining in the rearview mirror. We reached the motel, a small place off the road leading toward North Chicago. I parked under a light and turned toward her. "From now on, you never have to stay quiet to protect someone else's secrets." She nodded again, her gaze steady even as her chin trembled. Inside the room, the air was cool and smelled faintly of detergent. I locked the door behind us. Lila climbed onto the bed without being told and curled beneath the blanket, clutching her backpack to her chest. Her breathing deepened, slow and heavy, exhaustion finally pulling her under. I stood beside her until her breaths evened out, my hand resting gently on the edge of the blanket. The soft rise and fall of her chest grounded me more than anything I had felt all day. She was safe. For the moment, that was enough. But as I turned off the lamp, the truth settled deep and irrevocable inside me. Someone had planned for me not to survive this week, and I was done pretending not to see the things people thought they could hide from me. Lila shifted beside me in the motel bed, murmuring something in her sleep, as if the fear from earlier had followed her even here. I sat in the dark for a long minute, listening to the hum of the old air conditioner and letting my eyes adjust to the day, cheap flickering streetlight bleeding through the curtains. The motel was quiet, but my mind was still standing in that kitchen hours earlier, my hand on the refrigerator door, staring at the food meant to finish me. The memory returned with such clarity that it felt as though I had never left the house at all. That was where everything had begun to crack open. That was where Lila had first looked at me with a truth she had no business carrying. For a long moment, I did not move. The refrigerator door was still cold against my fingertips, and Lila's warning seemed to echo through the quiet kitchen like a sound the walls. We were not ready to absorb. When I finally turned back to her, she stood small and rigid in the middle of the tile floor, as if she was bracing herself for whatever came next. I realized then that she had been doing that for months. Bracing, waiting, carrying more truth than a 10-year-old should ever have to carry. "Come on, sweetheart. Let us go upstairs for a minute." Her hand slipped into mine without hesitation. The second floor felt strangely muffled, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I guided her into the guest room I was supposed to sleep in for the next 3 nights. Her small backpack sat on the bed where Cassandra had tossed it earlier, unzipped, clothes spilling out like an afterthought. I closed the door gently and sat on the edge of the bed. Lila stood in front of me, her shoulders tight, her posture stiff in a way no child achieves by accident. She was waiting for permission. Or waiting for punishment. It was hard to tell which she was more accustomed to. "Let us start slowly. You can tell me as much or as little as you want. But I need to understand what is happening." Her lower lip trembled, but she did not look away. She took a breath that shook her entire frame. Then another. Then finally the words began to form. It started after the accident. Her voice sounded different now, not as rushed as before, almost rehearsed, like she had said these sentences in her head 100 times, without ever letting them out. "We were driving home from school. Mommy and Gregory were fighting. He said he could not pay for anything. She said she was tired of fixing everything. She kept looking at him instead of the road." I watched her fingers twist into the hem of her shirt, pulling it tight. Then the car made a loud noise. Dylan screamed. The window broke. "Everything hurts," but only for a minute. She paused and pointed at her head. "The doctor said nothing was wrong with me. Just scared. He said I could talk if I wanted." I swallowed, feeling my pulse rise, not from surprise, but from the confirmation of what I already sensed. I reached forward and touched her hand, grounding her. "So why did you stop talking, sweetheart?" She looked down. "Mommy said it would make things worse. She said Dylan was the one who was hurt. She said it would look bad if I talked again before he could. She said Gregory would get mad, that he would leave and we would lose everything." Lose everything. The phrase hit me with the weight of something I had heard before, not in those words, but in the tone of someone who believes survival depends on performance. Cassandra had lived that way since we were children, always adjusting, always shaping the truth to fit her fear of abandonment. I had never imagined she would extend that fear into the body of her own daughter. Lila looked up at me then, her eyes big and shining with something that did not belong in a child. So I pretended. Because she said I had to help, that I had to make it fair. My breath caught. Fair, the twisted logic of an adult imposed on a child who had no understanding of them. Rules she was being forced to follow. I scooted closer so our knees touched. That was not fair. And it was not your job. It was never your job to make the grown-ups feel better. She blinked fast, swallowing her tears. She was not used to anyone saying her feelings were allowed to exist. Tell me what you heard last night. You did nothing wrong by telling me. I just need to understand everything. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. At first, I thought she was scared. But then I realized it was something else. Determination. A kind of bravery that shows up only in children who have spent too long carrying fear quietly. They were in the kitchen. Mommy said she put the food in the right containers. Gregory said 3 days is enough. He said you would not even know it was them. And Mommy said the house would go to her because you are alone. The words landed with a hard finality, like puzzle pieces snapping into place. My house. Not this one in Evanston, but the house in Skokie. My parents' house. The place that held everything I had left of them. The place Cassandra had tried to convince me I did not need. Lila watched my face carefully, searching for signs of anger directed at her. I forced my breathing to stay steady. Come sit with me. She climbed onto the bed beside me and leaned her shoulder against mine. Her body was small enough that I could feel every tremor moving through her. I wrapped an arm around her gently. You did the right thing by telling me. You were brave. Braver than any adult in this house has been in a long time. Her breath hitched, and then she nodded, resting her head lightly on my arm. A memory surfaced then, uninvited but sharp. Lila at 6 years old, sitting in my lap at a 4th of July picnic. Sticky from melted popsicle juice. She looked up at me with the same solemn eyes and said, Auntie, you do not need a husband. You are already enough. I had laughed at the time, thinking it was something she picked up from a cartoon or a book. But even then, she had been watching the adults around her, studying the ways people tried and failed to love each other properly. Now that memory took on a different weight. She had always understood more than anyone realized. She had always seen too clearly the tension between truth and performance. I looked down at her now, older, bruised by circumstance, and I felt something shift in me. Not anger, not fear. Something deeper. The awareness that this child had been punished for healing, punished for existing, punished for speaking. She had been trained to believe her voice threatened the fragile balance her mother tried to hold together with lies. You are allowed to be well, Lila. You are allowed to talk. You are allowed to exist without being punished for it. She lifted her head, searching my face, trying to gauge whether this was another rule or a real promise. When she decided to believe me, her shoulders relaxed, and the tension in her jaw softened. Do you believe me, sweetheart? She nodded slowly. Good, because nothing that happened was your fault. Not the accident, not the silence, not last night, none of it. She let out a tiny breath, almost a sigh, and leaned against me again. Her body finally settled, the way children settle only when they feel safe enough to rest. Outside the window, the afternoon light shifted, turning the room a muted gold. The house was quiet, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was quiet before a storm decided what to break next. I looked around the room and felt the shape of a new truth forming. This was not only a matter of poisoned food, or inheritance, or desperation. This was about a child who had been told she did not have the right to heal. A child whose wellness was treated like a threat. A child who had been forced into silence so adults could keep pretending. I would not let that continue. I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. We will figure this out, but we will do it together. No more pretending. Not for either of us. She nodded again, smaller this time, but sure. I sat with her until her breathing steadied. Not sleep exactly, but a deep, heavy calm that comes when fear finally loosens its grip. When she seemed settled enough to be alone for a moment, I stood, stretching my stiff legs. Her eyes opened slightly. Auntie, are you leaving? Just for a minute. I will be right here in the house." She nodded and curled into the pillow. I walked to the doorway and looked back at her small figure under the blanket. She looked fragile in a way that made me feel something sharp in my chest. But she also looked stronger than any child should have to be. I stepped into the hallway and closed the door halfway, not enough to shut her out, just enough to give her a sense of safety. Downstairs, the kitchen waited in its terrible stillness. The containers in the refrigerator lined up like a plan. The scent of the house. The silence. I felt my stomach tighten, not from fear, but from recognition. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a choice. And it was the moment I knew something else, too. Lila was not the only one who had been denied the right to exist freely. The house, the silence, the food, the plan. All of it spoke one truth. Someone had decided my life was easier to erase than to live with. I stood there a long time, letting that truth settle into the room. Then I turned back toward the stairs. I had a child to protect, and I had a story to stop before it went any further. For a few long seconds, I stayed there in the hallway, listening to the faint rise and fall of Lila's breath behind the half-closed door, feeling the weight of what I had just promised settle into my spine. Protecting her, protecting myself. It was no longer a question of whether something terrible was happening in that house. It was now a matter of getting us out before the story Cassandra and Gregory had, set in motion, reached its ending. And I knew with a clarity that felt almost physical that the ending they imagined did not include me walking out alive. I went back downstairs with a steadiness that surprised me. My hands did not shake. My thoughts did not scatter. Everything moved in a clean line, the way my mind used to work in the conservation lab before openings at the museum. Step 1. Step 2. Step 3. Preserve what can be saved. Remove what threatens the integrity of the structure. The skill had always felt professional. Now it felt personal. I opened the refrigerator one more time, not because I doubted Lila, but because evidence mattered. The containers were still there, perfectly aligned. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3. The handwriting looked cheerful, almost affectionate. It made my stomach tighten in a slow, cold twist. I pulled out my phone and took pictures from every angle. Close up, far back. Labels, lids, scratch marks, container seals that looked tampered with. I photographed the smoothie bottle, the salad, and the casserole, every detail recorded. Then I reached for the gloves under the sink, the same box Cassandra used for cleaning, and slid a pair on carefully. With the refrigerator still open, I took each item out and placed it into a plastic tote bag I found beside the pantry. I sealed the bag and took photos of the sealed state, too. It felt meticulous, purposeful, necessary, the kind of thing the old me would have overthought, but the current me accepted as the only logical way forward. When I turned around, Lila was standing at the bottom of the stairs, her stuffed fox tucked under her arm, her hair a little messy from lying down. She looked so small in that big house, like a child standing in the doorway of a storm. "Are we leaving, Aunt Mara?" "Yes, sweetheart, we are leaving now." She did not ask why. She did not ask where. She simply nodded, a small, determined motion that made her look older than 10. I walked her back upstairs and helped her gather her clothes. I grabbed her toothbrush, her little journal, the pair of sneakers she liked because they made her run faster. She packed quietly, obediently, as if leaving in the middle of the day with no explanation was something she had learned not to question. I finished zipping her backpack and touched her shoulder gently. "You do not have to stay quiet anymore. Not with me. Not ever again." Her eyes filled with something fragile, something hopeful, and she whispered a barely audible, "Okay," before slipping her hand into mine. We walked downstairs together. I locked the front door behind us. The click of the deadbolt felt final in a way I had not expected, like closing a chapter, not just a house. The drive north was uneventful. Lila fell asleep halfway, her head leaning toward the window. I kept one hand on the wheel and one eye on the rearview mirror, checking her reflection every few minutes the way I used to check the temperature in the conservation room when handling delicate materials. She was something delicate too, but not fragile. She had endured more than most adults I knew, but endurance is not the same thing as safety. The motel sat just outside North Chicago, a modest, 2-story building painted an uncommitted beige. It was the kind of place travelers used when they needed a place to rest, but did not want to spend the extra money for comfort. Fine for a night, functional, clean enough. Most importantly, far enough from Evanston that Cassandra and Gregory would not casually drive past. Yet. I checked in under my full name. The clerk barely looked up from his computer screen. The normalcy of it felt almost surreal. I guided Lila up the stairs to the room near the end of the walkway. Inside, the air held the faint scent of detergent and something citrus. The carpet was worn but vacuumed. The bedding is simple but fresh. I locked the door, slid the security chain across, and tested the deadbolt twice. Only when the room felt secure did I pull out my phone. The first call was to Rachel. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp but steady, the way attorneys sound when they sense there is no time for small talk. Tell me everything. I kept it short. The food, the warning, the photos, the bag I had filled. She inhaled sharply but did not interrupt. This is not a family dispute anymore, Mara. This is criminal intent. You need evidence. And you need to make sure nothing gets contaminated. Already done. The items are sealed. Good. Call Aaron. Now. He can get the samples into a lab faster than I can file anything. When I hung up, Leela was watching me from the bed, curled around her fox again. Her eyes looked clearer now, less frightened, more curious. Is the food bad? Aunt Mara. Really bad. I sat beside her and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. We do not know yet, sweetheart. That is what the tests will tell us. But you were right to warn me. You were very brave. She nodded, accepting the praise with the quiet dignity of a child who rarely received it. I called Aaron next. He picked up immediately. I have something for you, I said without preface. Food samples. Sealed. Photographed. Suspicious containers. A child's statement that suggests deliberate contamination. His silence lasted barely a moment. Where are you? A motel near North Chicago. Room 12. I will send a car. Keep them sealed. Do not open anything. And do not go back to the house. I am not. Good. Stay put. I will call you after we get the samples processed. When I hung up, the room felt heavier, but not suffocating. The truth was out of my hands now, moving into the system where people like Aaron knew how to use it. Lila stretched out and pulled the blanket over her legs. Aunt Mara. Yes, sweetheart. Can I talk now? Really talk? Even if Mommy comes back? Her voice cracked on the last word, and something inside me cracked with it. You can talk whenever you need to, and no one will make you pretend again. Not your mom. Not anyone. She nodded, a tiny motion at first, then bigger as she let the truth settle into her chest. She looked so young at that moment, so desperately relieved, that I felt a tightness in my throat I had to swallow back. She lay down fully then, the fox tucked beneath her chin. Her breaths evened out slowly until they reached a soft, steady rhythm. I sat in the chair near the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the carpet. The tote bag sat on the small table between the beds, sealed, silent, holding whatever truth Cassandra had hoped would pass unnoticed. Outside, the sun dipped low, turning the motel parking lot into long strips of gold and shadow. Cars came and went. Doors opened and closed. People move through their days without knowing how close some of us come to, vanishing quietly. I leaned back in the chair, stretching my legs out in front of me. A strange kind of calm settled over me then. Not relief, not fear. Something firmer. A recognition. A line drawn. I looked over at Leela one more time, her small form curled in the blanket, the soft rise and fall of her breathing steady and warm. No one is making you disappear anymore. The words lingered in my mind long after they left my mouth. I watched Lila sleep for a few more breaths, her small body curled beneath the motel blanket, her stuffed fox tucked under her chin. When the knock on the door came, soft but deliberate, I stood carefully so the mattress would not shift. A female officer stepped inside and nodded once, offering the kind of calm presence that makes children trust you without being told to. She would stay with Lila, she said. They would keep the hallway monitored. No one would come near the room without clearance. I thanked her quietly and followed the two officers waiting outside. The parking lot was cold, the air sharp enough to wake parts of me I had ignored for weeks. We got into the cruiser and the door shut with a firmness that reminded me how real everything had become. This was no longer suspected. This was an investigation. The ride to Skokie took less than 30 minutes. I had driven this route thousands of times, from museum shifts to holidays to routine errands in the years after my parents passed. Tonight it felt foreign, like someone had rearranged the geography while I was not looking. Streetlights blurred past the windows. Familiar storefronts appeared and vanished before I could name them. The house sat at the end of the quiet block. The same beige siding, the same maple tree in the yard, the same walkway my dad used to shovel meticulously after every snowfall. Nothing looked different from the outside. If anything, it looked too normal, too still. Untouched by the truth I carried with me now. One officer stepped out first, scanning the yard, then nodded. I opened my door and followed them up the walkway. My key turned smoothly in the lock. The stale scent of a closed-up home drifted out, mixed with faint traces of lavender from the sachets my mom always tucked into drawers. The familiarity hit me in a way I was not prepared for. We stepped inside. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that belonged to childhood bedtime routines and weekend mornings, when my dad read the paper in silence. Not the threatening quiet of Cassandra's kitchen, just stillness. I led the officers through the living room. The furniture remained just as it had been before my mom passed 3 years earlier. A crocheted throw blanket over the back of the couch. A framed photo of all of us at Lake Michigan. A ceramic bowl she bought at a craft fair in Wisconsin. Each item held memories I had kept tucked away like museum pieces, preserved but not touched. The officers waited for my direction. I pointed to the hallway. I need documents. Identification papers, financial files, anything I might need if this becomes bigger than it already is. They nodded and accompanied me to my dad's old office. The room smelled faintly of paper and dust, like time had settled here more heavily than anywhere else. I opened the filing cabinet and pulled out folders labeled with my handwriting. Birth certificate, passport, bank statements, insurance forms. I placed everything into a canvas bag I had brought with me. One officer moved quietly around the perimeter of the room, documenting each section. They said it was standard procedure when a residence could become relevant to a larger case. I appreciated the professionalism. It created structure in a moment that could have easily tipped into chaos. From there, I walked them to the master bedroom. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open. My mom's room had always felt untouched, preserved, as though she had simply stepped out for a moment and would return any second. Her bedspread lay smooth, untouched. A framed picture of my parents at their 40th anniversary sat on her nightstand. Her reading glasses rested beside it. I moved toward the dresser. My fingers brushed the wooden edge, and for a moment I felt 12 years old again, standing there while my mom brushed my hair before school. I opened the top drawer. Inside were stacks of cards, old letters, recipes in her careful handwriting. Beneath them lay a folder labeled Estate. My breath hitched slightly as I lifted it. I opened the folder slowly, careful not to smudge the pages. There it was. The will she had signed the year she got sick. The paper had yellowed slightly, but her signature remained crisp. The distinctive swirl at the beginning of her first name, the small curve on the last letter. She had signed this without hesitation. She had left the house to me. My throat tightened. I placed my hand on the document, feeling the reality of it beneath my palm. My mom had known who she could trust, who would care for this place, who would not take shortcuts or bend morality to get what they wanted. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. A late-night text after the funeral. Cassandra's message. You are alone. You do not need that house. At the time, I convinced myself it was grief speaking. Cassandra had always been dramatic when emotional. I let myself believe it. But now, with Leela's voice echoing in my mind, and the evidence I had photographed earlier, the message twisted into something darker. It had not been grief. It had been intent, a warning to soften me toward an outcome she had already begun imagining. I closed the folder. One officer asked if I needed help carrying anything. I shook my head. I stepped into the hall again. The hardwood creaked just as it always had. I glanced toward the small lamp by the stairs. My dad fixed that lamp every time it flickered, saying he could not stand broken things in a home meant to hold a family together. The memory stung in a quiet, steady way. I walked to the kitchen and opened the drawer where my mom kept spare keys, old coins, and handwritten notes she never wanted to lose. My fingers skimmed the items automatically. The motion grounded in habit more than intention. It reminded me how much I had inherited from this house. Not just walls and rooms. Stability, values, a sense of rightness. Cassandra had never cared about, I gathered my financial documents from a small lockbox beside the fridge. Account information. Old tax returns, receipts from repairs I had made over the years to keep the house in good condition. My parents valued maintenance. They valued the work required to keep something whole. Cassandra valued possession, ownership without effort. The officers stayed close but not intrusive. Their presence reminded me that this place, my parents' home, might become part of an investigation that extended far beyond family conflict. I moved to the back window. The yard stretched out quietly, the garden bed still lined with wooden frames where my mom used to grow tomatoes. Every summer she would complain about the heat, about mosquitoes, about weeds that grew faster than she could pull them. Yet she planted again every spring. She said gardens were a kind of hope, a promise that something would grow, even when life felt thin. Looking at the empty garden beds now, I felt both the echo of her presence and the ache of the ways Cassandra had tried to weaponize absence. If I had died, the officer said gently from behind me, Cassandra would have been your next of kin. I nodded without speaking. The reality felt like a hand pressed against the center of my chest. Yes, she would have inherited everything. The officer did not respond. She did not need to. We finished gathering the items I needed. I carried the folders under my arm, the canvas bag slung over my shoulder. As we stepped out the front door, I locked it carefully. The lock clicked once, then again as I tested it. We walked down the steps together. The officers returned to their cruiser. I reached my own car and placed the bag on the passenger seat. Before starting the engine, I sat still for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. The house looked peaceful in the soft afternoon light, exactly as my parents had always wanted it to be. My phone buzzed beside me. I glanced at the screen. The number displayed a Chapel Hill area code, the lab. I answered quickly. The voice on the line sounded polite, professional, apologetic. They needed more time. Another 24 hours to confirm findings. Protocol required precision. They could not risk a false result on something this serious. I thanked them. My voice was steady, almost too steady. When I hung up, I looked back at the house again. My parents had left it to me with trust. Cassandra had decided trust was an inconvenience. I started the car. The engine rumbled softly. As I pulled away from the curb, a strange calm washed over me. Not peace. Not acceptance, clarity. They wanted me gone. They wanted this house. They wanted the version of life they believed they deserved. But I was still here, and now I finally understood the cost of that fact. I drove back toward the motel, the sky beginning to dim into the first hints of evening. The road unwound in front of me like a path toward whatever came next. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt ready. The drive back to the motel felt shorter than before, as if the road had contracted, or the distance between what I knew and what I feared had finally closed in on itself. When I parked, the lot was mostly empty except for a pickup truck and a small sedan with fogged windows. The cold air hit my face as soon as I stepped out, sharp enough to keep my thoughts aligned in a straight, steady line. Inside the room, the lights were dim. Lila was still asleep, her small body turned toward the wall, her stuffed fox tucked beneath her chin. The female officer nodded at me from the table, where she sat writing in a small notebook. She whispered that Lila had slept the entire time. No nightmares, no restlessness. I thanked her and she stood, said her shift was ending, and left quietly. When the door clicked shut behind her, the room settled into a deep stillness. I placed the canvas bag of documents on the small dresser. My shoulders felt heavy, but not with fatigue. It was the weight of waiting. Waiting for the lab, waiting for the next step, waiting for the air to shift into whatever came after truth. My phone buzzed just as I sat on the edge of the other bed. The vibration rolled through the thin mattress. Detective Aaron's name appeared on the screen. I answered quickly. He did not soften his voice. He did not ease me toward anything. Detectives rarely do, when the facts themselves are heavy enough. Mara, the lab in Chapel Hill, finished the preliminary analysis. His voice had the steady tone of someone reading off information he had prepared himself to hear. All samples tested positive for ricin. A low dose, slow acting, lethal within a few days, depending on body weight and exposure. The words landed inside me like cold stones, one after another. Low dose, slow acting, lethal. I felt my spine go rigid. My breathing did not speed up. It simply grew shallow, as if my lungs could no longer decide how much space I was allowed to take up. The motel walls felt closer, the air thinner, the silence sharper. Aaron continued. The containers from the refrigerator had the highest concentrations. The smoothie, the casserole, even the salad dressing. Everything was prepared for you. We confirmed that. My hand tightened around the phone. I stared at the floor, as if it could explain something to me, as if the cheap carpet had answers woven into its fibers. He went on. Based on the timing, ingestion within a few days would have caused organ failure. Symptoms would look like a viral illness at first. Fatigue, dehydration, nausea, then respiratory distress, then collapse. I pressed my free hand against my chest. It felt like someone had placed a cold palm there and pushed down with slow, deliberate pressure. Not enough to hurt, enough to remind me that my heartbeat was something Cassandra had calculated into a timeline. Aaron paused before adding the next part. The dose was control, not an accident. No contamination. Intentional application, consistent with attempted murder. The moment he said the words, the air in the room turned still. Nothing moved. Not the curtains. Not the lamp cord. Not even the thin hum of the refrigerator seemed to breathe. Attempted murder. The phrase did not echo in my mind. It settled. It did not frighten me. It anchored something that had been drifting inside me since the moment Lila said, "Auntie, do not touch the food." I asked quietly if the results were final. Final enough to move forward, he said. The formal report will arrive within 24 hours, but I wanted you to hear this from me first. I thanked him. My voice sounded distant, as if I were hearing myself from the end of a hallway. After we hung up, the silence returned, thicker now, heavier. Every corner of the room seemed to hold a shadow I had not noticed before. Not threatening shadows. Truth shadows. The kind you greet when you finally stop pretending the world is softer than it is. My chest tightened again, then loosened. The physical reaction felt foreign. My body understood before my mind did. This was not fear. It was the shock of survival brushing against the place where danger had almost settled permanently. I reached for the water bottle on the table but did not drink it. My hand trembled once, barely. Then steadied. I pressed both palms against my thighs and breathed slowly until the weight in my chest eased. A soft sound pulled my attention back to the other bed. Lila shifted in her sleep, her fingers curling around the corner of her fox. Her lips parted slightly, and a faint breath escaped, the uncomplicated breath of a child who had been holding her world together for many months without anyone noticing. She saved my life. The realization rose through me in a clean, powerful line, without drama, without panic. If she had not spoken, if she had waited until morning, if fear had stayed wrapped around her the way Cassandra had forced it to stay, if she had believed she would lose everything by telling the truth, I would have eaten what was in the refrigerator. It was not a hypothetical. It was a fact. I had been in that kitchen long enough to think the casserole looked comforting. I had nearly reached for the smoothie out of habit, a habit that would have carried my death inside it. I stood and walked to her bed. I sat slowly on the edge so the mattress would dip just enough for her to sense my presence. She did not wake. Her breath flowed in and out, steady and peaceful, something that felt like a privilege to witness. I brushed a strand of hair away from her cheek. It clung to my finger for a moment. Her skin was warm, soft, alive, a reminder that children endure things adults cannot imagine, yet still find ways to reach for hope. A knock sounded softly on the door. I rose quietly and opened it. Rachel stood in the hallway, wearing a long coat and holding a folder. Her expression was controlled, but her eyes sharpened when she saw my face. "You heard," she said. I nodded. She stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her before speaking again. "Ryson changes everything. This is no longer family tension or financial disagreement. This is attempted murder with a clear inheritance motive." Her voice had that firm legal cadence that used to steady me during difficult exhibits at the museum. She was precise. She did not add drama where drama already existed. She sat at the small table and motioned for me to join her. I did. She opened the folder and slid a notepad between us. "Based on the preliminary findings," Rachel said, This aligns with premeditation. The placement in multiple food items, the concentration levels, the timing relative to your weekend staying there. And she paused before adding the part she knew would land hardest. And the fact that you are the sole legal owner of a house your sister believes should have been hers. I stared at the tabletop, tracing the faint scratch marks left by previous guests. My voice was steady when I spoke. If I had died, Cassandra would inherit everything. Rachel nodded. Yes. As your only sibling, with both parents deceased and no spouse or children, she would be your next of kin. It is one of the clearest motives a prosecutor could ask for. The phrase snapped something inside me, not painfully, but with clarity. Cassandra had not panicked. She had not made a desperate mistake. She had made a calculated decision rooted in entitlement, jealousy, and the belief that my life was an obstacle to what she wanted. My throat tightened again, this time with something deeper. Not grief, not anger, resolve. Rachel looked at me carefully. Mara, we will move forward on this, but I need to know where you stand emotionally. This is going to get harder before it gets easier. I glanced toward the sleeping child on the bed. Her small chest rose and fell beneath the blanket with a gentle rhythm. I am standing right here, I said quietly, and I am not stepping back. Rachel closed the folder and rested her hand on top of it. Good, because you are not alone in this. When she left, the room felt different, not lighter, stronger. I sat on the edge of my bed again and let the truth settle into the parts of me that had spent years avoiding conflict for the sake of keeping peace that was never real. They tried to kill me, not metaphorically, not emotionally, physically, intentionally, methodically. The thought did not unravel me. It grounded me. It rewrote the past few years with a precision I had not allowed myself to see before. Every comment, every argument, every tense holiday, every complaint about the house, every moment Cassandra looked at me with a strange mix of resentment and expectation. She had been rehearsing a world where I did not exist. I looked at Lila again. Her small fingers relaxed, her cheek pressed into the pillow. Her breathing is steady, I whispered into the dim room, careful not to wake her. You saved my life. The words were not dramatic. They were not meant to be heard. They were truth spoken into a quiet space, where truth finally felt safe. I stood once more, crossed the room, and drew the curtains closed. The outside lights cast a faint glow across the floor, just enough to see, but not enough to disturb the hush of the room. The cold heaviness that had lived in my chest since the moment I opened. Cassandra's refrigerator finally loosened. Not because anything was resolved, nothing was resolved, but because now I knew what needed to be done. I would not hide. I would not retreat. I would not hope this would fade quietly into apologetic explanations or tearful excuses. I would survive, and I would end this story before it wrote another line in my absence. I walked back to my bed and lowered myself onto the thin mattress. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the heater and Lila's breathing. I closed my eyes, and I prepared for what would come next. I woke before the sun, the kind of waking that happens when sleep is nothing more than a brief pause between two heavy thoughts. Lila was still curled under her blanket, her breathing soft and steady. The sky outside the motel curtains held the faintest gray light. Morning was coming whether I wanted it or not. I sat up slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had shifted in less than 2 days. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. I reached for it quickly, half expecting another delay from the lab, but the caller ID showed Detective Aaron. I answered quietly so I would not wake Lila. His voice came through with that steady firmness he seemed to carry like a second uniform. He said he had updates and asked if I could step outside where we could speak privately. I slipped into my shoes and grabbed my coat. When I opened the door, cold air rushed across my face, sharp enough to clear whatever remnants of sleep I had left. I stepped into the corridor and pulled the door closed behind me. Aaron began without hesitation. We have been looking into Gregory's finances. There is a significant amount of debt. Not small, not recent. His words grew heavier as he spoke. We are looking at close to $800,000. Multiple credit lines, gambling markers, failed investments. It is layered and complicated, but the total stands around that figure, $800,000. The number made me still, not because of its size, but because of what it revealed. desperation, recklessness. A man capable of sinking a family silently while pretending everything around him was functioning the way it should. I leaned against the concrete wall and breathed out slowly. That is almost impossible to recover from. Exactly, Aaron said, and he did not act alone. We have communication records, browser histories, financial transfers between accounts tied to both of them. Nothing that proves conspiracy yet, but enough to establish shared knowledge of the situation. The picture was forming, piece by piece. A puzzle they had hoped I would never see. Aaron continued, "There is also something else, something more sensitive." I prepared myself. Sensitive had become a euphemism for devastating. He cleared his throat quietly. We pulled the medical records for Dylan. The accident left him with complications that require corrective surgery. The timeline for the procedure is tight. 6 to 9 months before long-term damage becomes difficult to reverse, and the cost is significant. Insurance covers some, but not all. We are talking numbers that would crush most families, even the stable ones. 6 to 9 months. A child with his entire future balanced on a clock running silently in the background. And Cassandra had chosen to silence Lila instead of protecting her own son. I pressed my palm against my stomach as if the physical contact could steady them. Twist forming there. How expensive is the surgery? Aaron paused again, almost carefully. Around $200,000 out of pocket. Maybe more depending on recovery. I stared at the empty parking lot. The sun had begun to rise, turning the sky a pale, indifferent blue. A mother with a son in need of a life-altering surgery. A husband drowning in debt. 2 people staring at a future closing in on them like a tightening fist. And then there was me, the younger sister. The one with an inherited house. The one with no spouse, no children, no dependents. The one who could disappear without a ripple. My voice was quiet but steady when I spoke again. They thought if I died, Cassandra would inherit the house immediately. She would have access to the value, enough equity to keep Gregory whole, enough financial breathing room to handle the surgery. She would save her marriage. She would keep her life intact. Aaron exhaled. Yes, that is the working theory. The motive is clear. The timeline is aligned. The opportunity was precise. Ricin fits the pattern perfectly. Slow, hard to detect in early stages, and the entire plan hinges on your absence. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to block anything out, but to let it settle, to let myself feel the truth without collapsing under it. When I opened them again, the sky was brighter. Morning had come fully now, painting the motel building with flat, unforgiving light. I asked him if there was any sign that they hesitated, any sign that Cassandra had second thoughts, any sign that she had worried for her children more than she worried for herself. Aaron's silence told me everything before he spoke. From what we can see, no. The choices were deliberate, methodical, coordinated. I nodded even though he could not see me. Thank you for telling me. We will move forward, he said. You stay with Lila. We will keep you updated. He hung up, and I stayed outside for a long moment, letting the cold air brace me. Then I went back inside the room. Lila was sitting up now, rubbing her eyes with her fists. She looked younger in that moment, smaller, as though the truth she carried had taken a year off her age overnight. She looked at me with that tentative expression children use when they are afraid. The world shifted without them. I sat beside her and placed my hand gently on her back. She relaxed a little. Did the doctor call you again? She asked in a voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. They found out more things. Her eyes lifted toward mine. Is it bad? It is not your fault, I said first, because that mattered more than anything. Then I told her as gently as I could that people make terrible choices when they are scared. But fear does not excuse hurting others. It does not excuse hurting you. She looked down at her hands. Her fingers twisted at the edge of the blanket. Mommy said Dylan would not get better if she did not keep our family together. Something sharp moved inside my chest. An ache mixed with anger. Cassandra had twisted motherhood into a weapon. She had used love as a leash. She had convinced her daughter that silence was salvation. I brushed a loose strand of hair from Lila's face. You were never supposed to carry that. That was not your job. and it was not true. She swallowed hard. Her small voice trembled. Did Mommy need you to go away so she could fix everything? The question had no innocence. It had awareness. The kind of awareness only a child who has seen too much can form. I took her hand. No one fixes anything by hurting someone else. What they planned was wrong. It was wrong from the beginning. She nodded slowly, but I could see her mind working, trying to rearrange the entire world she thought she knew. We sat together quietly for a few minutes. The room smelled faintly of the motel soap and the old air conditioner. The hum of a truck passing by on the street drifted in through the thin windows. I thought about everything Aaron had said. The debt, the surgery, the pressure that must have felt unbearable to them. A marriage held together by fear of collapse. A son with a medical crisis they were not emotionally prepared to face. A house they saw as salvation. And me. Always me. The quiet one. The reliable one. The one they assumed would not fight back. But I did not feel sympathy. I did not feel pity. Understanding does not equal forgiveness, and comprehension does not erase intention. Cassandra had stood at my mom's bedside after her last round of treatment and sworn she would protect this family. She had cried into my shoulder. She had told me we were all leaving. Then she went home and planned my absence. It hit me then with a clarity that felt almost physical. She had chosen to sacrifice her own child's voice. She had chosen to weaponize fear against both of her children. Lila with silence, Dylan with shame. Cassandra had not just endangered me. She had broken the two people she was supposed to love more than anything, and there was no excuse for that. Not debt, not pressure, not marriage, not survival. No circumstance existed that could justify harming a child to protect an adult life. I stood and walked to the window. The parking lot was nearly empty. A small bird hopped along the sidewalk, pecking at a crumb near the curb. The ordinary world felt so distant from the one we were living in. I made a decision then. A clean, silent decision that settled deep in my bones. I would not let Cassandra or Gregory near these children again. Not until the truth was no longer something that could be denied. Not until safety was something I could offer without fear of it being ripped away. I turned back to Lila. She watched me with those searching eyes, waiting for something she could trust. I sat on the edge of the bed and took both of her hands in mine. "You are safe with me," I said quietly. "And I am going to make sure you stay safe. You and Dylan both." Her shoulders dropped. Not fully, not completely, but enough. She nodded once. A small movement, a brave one. Outside, the sun had climbed high enough to brighten the top of the motel sign. A car door slammed in the distance. Life kept moving, even here. Even in the aftermath of attempted murder, life kept finding its way forward. I looked at the small child in front of me and understood something with absolute certainty. Cassandra had been willing to destroy her own daughter to keep her world intact, but I would not let that world touch Lila ever again. And I would not let it swallow Dylan either. The next part of this story would not be about survival. It would be about rescue. I took a slow breath as the day unfolded around us, and I prepared myself for everything that needed to happen next. The decision settled into me with a weight that felt firm rather than crushing. If Cassandra and Gregory were willing to harm their own children to preserve whatever fragile life they were clinging to, then I needed to provide truth strong enough to cut through every lie they had stacked around themselves. I needed evidence. Hard evidence, and I knew exactly where it would be. Detective Aaron called just after mid-morning. His tone was direct, carrying an urgency that had no panic, only purpose. He said officers could escort me to the Evanston house so we could collect anything that might support the findings from the lab. They would conduct a structured search with my permission. They wanted me present because the property did not belong to law enforcement, and they could not open anything without consent. I glanced at Lila, who was sitting on the motel bed tracing small circles on the blanket with her thumb. The quiet rhythm had become her self-soothing pattern. She looked up at me as though she could feel something heavy shifting nearby. I explained gently that someone from the police station would stay with her while I stepped out. She stiffened slightly, but when the female officer arrived and sat beside her with a soft voice and a calm posture, I saw Lila relax a little. Not fully, but enough to let me walk toward the door. I told her I would come back as soon as I could. She nodded, pulling her stuffed fox onto her lap like a promise she could hold. Outside, the air felt crisp, and the sky had brightened in that flat way Chicago mornings often do, when the weather cannot decide between warmth and cold. The patrol car pulled up, and I climbed into the back seat. The officers introduced themselves, but I barely absorbed their names. My mind was already turning toward what we might find. The drive to Evanston was short. Familiar neighborhoods blurred into each other, rows of houses with their neat lawns and trimmed hedges, people walking their dogs. A jogger crossed at the corner with headphones pulled over his ears. It struck me again how easily the dangerous parts of a life can hide beneath a veneer of normality. Cassandra's house came into view. The blinds were closed. The porch light, which Gregory always left on for pointless energy savings rituals, was still off. The place looked still, sealed under the illusion that its owners were only away for a vacation, not under investigation for attempted murder. 2 more officers were waiting. They briefed me as we walked up the small path toward the front door. They would document everything before touching it, then collect anything relevant for evidence. They would move carefully and stay with me in every room. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The moment the door closed behind us, the silence felt charged. Not peaceful. Not empty. Charged. This was the house where Cassandra had smiled at me across the kitchen table only 2 days before. This was the place where she had asked me to watch her child, to be the dependable sister she expected, on demand. The air still held the faint scent of the candle she burned before leaving, something floral and synthetic. One officer headed toward the kitchen, while another followed me into the living room. My eyes moved over the couch blankets folded neatly, the framed photos on the walls, the row of shoes lined up near the door. All the small details of a curated life. None of them revealed anything. But the truth was never in what people displayed. It was always hidden in what they tried to keep from sight. We moved down the hallway toward the primary bedroom. I felt something tighten in my chest as we entered. Not from fear, but from the knowledge that crossing this threshold might reveal the final pieces of a plan built on betrayal. Gregory's desk sat in the corner, cluttered with unopened mail, receipts, and a thin layer of dust that suggested he touched only the items that mattered to him. One officer asked if he could power on the laptop. I nodded. It was mine to consent to while I was present with law enforcement. He pressed the button and the screen glowed to life. There was no password. That alone told me something. Gregory trusted his privacy only because he assumed no one would ever challenge him. Not his wife, not his children, not me. While the laptop loaded, another officer moved toward Cassandra's closet. He asked before touching anything. I nodded again, my throat tight but my voice steady. He opened the closet doors. Inside were clothes arranged by color, shoes lined up on shelves, a row of handbags displayed like trophies. On the top shelf sat a polished jewelry box with floral carvings. He reached up, lifted it down carefully, and placed it on the bed. He opened the lid. The top tray held rings, bracelets, necklaces, all arranged with a precision Cassandra never applied to any other part of her life. The officer then lifted the tray to see underneath. There it was, a small beige pouch. It looked unremarkable, almost plain, which made the reality of it even more disturbing. He opened it over a sheet of paper. Small dark seeds spilled out, landing with a soft rattle. Castor beans. I recognized them instantly. Everyone does when they learn what ricin is made from. The sight of them made my skin prickle. The officer looked up at me, his expression shifting from professional distance to something heavier. He asked if the pouch belonged to me. I said no. Cassandra kept this jewelry box. No one else touched it. He nodded and sealed the pouch into an evidence bag. My legs felt steady, but some interior part of me seemed to tighten like a knot being pulled clean. The officer at the desk called us in. The laptop was open now. He had accessed the browser history. He turned the screen toward me. Search after search filled the page. How to extract ricin. How to mask ricin poisoning symptoms. How long ricin takes to cause organ failure. Inheritance rules when an unmarried sibling dies. Property transfer. Illinois. No spouse, no children. Signs of poisoning. Early stages. Every line was like a pin pushed deeper into a map I had already drawn in my mind. Each search term confirmed intention, not panic. Planning, not impulse. I stared at the screen until the edges blurred. Not because I was overwhelmed, because I recognized something in the pattern. They had not planned for my injury. They had planned for my disappearance. One officer approached with a stack of envelopes he found in the nightstand drawer. He flipped through. Bills, credit card offers, junk mail. Then he held out one envelope that looked different, thicker, more formal. He asked if I wanted to open it. My fingers did not shake. I slid the document out slowly. A life insurance policy, $600,000. The kind of number that could clear debts. The kind of number that could pay for a surgery. The kind of number that could give someone like Cassandra the safety she had always chased. The policy listed me as the insured. The beneficiary was Cassandra, and the signature at the bottom was mine. Except it was not. The curves were wrong. The angle of the letters was slightly off. Someone had practiced copying my handwriting and believed I would never live long enough to notice. For a moment, the room did not spin, or blur, or tilt. Instead, it sharpened. Every edge of every object seemed more defined. I had never been more aware of who I was, where I was standing, and what had been intended for me. I folded the paper and handed it back. The officers cataloged everything. Photos were taken, bags were sealed. The jewelry box, the pouch of castor beans, the laptop, the insurance form, the browser logs, the envelope. Each piece layered onto the next to form a single truth. They had done this together. They had woven a plan with enough detail to last months. They had done it calmly. When the officers finished, they walked with me to the door. I stepped outside and felt the cold air hit me like a clean slap. Not painful, clarifying. I thanked them. One told me they would file the evidence immediately. Another reminded me not to return here alone again. I nodded. When their squad cars pulled away, I remained standing on the small front path staring at the house, the place where mornings once began with laughter and coffee, the place where Cassandra had built the version of a life she wanted others to see. All of it now lay under a truth so dark, it seemed impossible that it had ever hidden in daylight. My phone buzzed. I did not need to check the screen to know who it was, but I looked anyway. It was a message from Cassandra. We are coming back early. Our flight lands tomorrow morning. I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not a shock, just clarity. They were coming home, and now I knew exactly what waited for them when they did. The message from Cassandra had ended with a simple period, but it may as well have been a countdown. I tucked the phone into my pocket and stood there a moment longer in the evening, air outside her house, letting the knowledge settle. They were coming back early. I would not have the luxury of time anymore. I drove straight to the motel, replaying every detail of what we had found. Castor beans. Insurance paperwork. Search history. Their nearly flawless plan to remove me as the one obstacle standing between them, and whatever future they believed they deserved. I kept my grip tight on the wheel as the highway hummed under the tires. Lila's warning echoed quietly in my mind, not as a child's frightened whisper, but as a truth spoken by someone who had seen far more than she should have. When I pushed open the motel room door, Lila sat on the bed exactly where I had left her, knees drawn in, fingers curled around the worn fur of her stuffed fox. Her eyes lifted the instant she heard me. She watched me with that mix of fear and hope that made my chest ache. I sat beside her and brushed a stray piece of hair from her cheek. I told her we needed to go somewhere. I kept my voice steady so she would know she was safe. She stood immediately. She never asked where we were going. She trusted me in a way that made me determined not to fail her. We left the motel and drove to Evanston, the sky dimming as a pale cloud cover slid across the sun. Lila sat quiet the entire way, legs pulled up in the seat, cheek resting on the window. Every time we passed under a streetlight, her reflection flickered in the glass, small and solemn, like she was disappearing and reappearing with every mile. Doctor. Hensley's office sat in a row of buildings along a quiet street, each one with a narrow walkway leading to a glass door. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of crayons and peppermint tea, soft lighting, friendly colors, a place designed to make hard things feel less heavy. Lila stayed close to my side until Dr. Hensley entered. The therapist crouched down so their eyes met. She said nothing at first. She waited, letting Lila choose the moment. After a few seconds, Lila reached for her hand. They walked into the therapy room together. I sat alone in the waiting room listening to the faint ticking of the wall clock. Each second stretched longer than the last. I clasped my hands together, then unclasped them, then clasped them again. I had not realized how much tension I carried until I saw how still the room was around me. 40 minutes passed before the door opened again. Lila stepped out slowly, her expression serious, her eyes slightly red. She looked old, as if something she had been holding inside her had finally spilled just enough to leave its mark. She wandered toward the table of coloring books. Dr. Hensley approached me quietly. Her expression held both sadness and certainty. She said Lila had repeated only one sentence. She said it more than once. She whispered it as if speaking the truth might break her. "If you talk, we will lose everything." The words moved through me like something cold and sharp. They were not instructions. They were threats, disguised as family loyalty. I thanked Dr. Hensley and signed the release form, giving her permission to speak with investigators. When I told Lila it was time to go, she stood without a sound and held my hand all the way to the car. At the motel, a uniformed officer stood waiting. He nodded politely and told me they had located Dylan. He was staying with the neighbor across from Cassandra's house, a woman named Mrs. Bauer. She often watched the children whenever Cassandra needed a break. The officer added that Dylan had not spoken since the accident, but appeared physically stable. If I wanted to visit, Mrs. Bauer had agreed. I looked down at Lila, her grip tightened, her eyes widening in the way they did whenever something hurt, but she refused to say it. I asked her softly if she wanted to see him. She nodded. We drove back into Cassandra's neighborhood, though I parked several houses away. I could not risk bringing Lila too close to a place where so much had already been lost. Mrs. Bauer opened the door before I even reached the porch. She looked relieved and worried at the same time. Inside, the house smelled like laundry detergent and lemon soap. The living room was small and cluttered with books and blankets, the kind of clutter that comes from comfort, not carelessness. Dylan sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a soft blue blanket. His small shoulders were hunched forward, his chin tucked into the fabric. His eyes looked tired in a way no child ever should. When he saw Lila standing behind me, he straightened so quickly the blanket slipped off one shoulder. His mouth parted slightly, but no sound came. Lila stepped toward him slowly, stopping halfway, searching his eyes as if afraid of breaking him with one wrong move. Dylan reached for the notepad on the table. His hand trembled just a little as he wrote. "Are you okay?" Lila nodded. He wrote something else, his handwriting careful and tight. "Where is Lila staying?" I told him she was with me for now, somewhere safe. He stared at me with a seriousness that seemed far too old for his age. Then he wrote a longer question. He hesitated, erased a word, rewrote it. "Mommy said Lila was not allowed to talk anymore." Was that bad? The question nearly knocked the air from my lungs. I knelt beside him so my face was level with his. I told him gently that Lila had done nothing wrong. He had done nothing wrong. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that children cannot understand because they should, never have been asked to understand them. I told him that none of this was his fault. His eyes filled quickly, and he blinked them clear with small, jerky motions of his hand. Lila reached out and touched his arm. The gesture was so careful, it felt like watching one injured bird comfort another. Dylan leaned toward her, their shoulders touching. Mrs. Bauer stepped into the kitchen with a hesitant smile. She said Dylan had been waking up from nightmares almost every night. She said he wrote Lila's name on paper because writing made him feel closer to her when he could not speak. She said he had asked every morning if she was angry with him. Hearing that broke something open inside me. Not anger, not sorrow exactly, but a kind of fierce recognition. These children were not two halves of Cassandra's story. They were not rivals for affection or security. They were two frightened souls stitched together by trauma, clinging to each other in a storm they never consented to enter. We stayed for almost an hour. When it was time to leave, Lila hugged Dylan. He hugged her back with both arms, burying his face in her shoulder. Mrs. Bauer promised to keep him safe until the authorities made a decision. The ride back to the motel was quiet. Lila hugged her fox again. but her eyes were brighter, not because anything had been solved, but because she had seen her brother and knew he was alive, safe, and still hers, in the only way that mattered. When we entered the room, she climbed onto the bed and curled beneath the thin motel blanket. I turned off the lamp beside her and sat in the chair near the window. The evening light filtered through the curtains in soft gold streaks. The room had that particular silence that forms only when a child has finally reached a point of temporary rest. My phone buzzed, a reminder of Cassandra's message still sitting unread. Lila slept with her hand tucked under her cheek, her breathing steady and light. I looked at her. Then I thought of Dylan sitting at that kitchen table, gripping a pencil like it was the only tool he had left to speak with. They were not obstacles. They were not part of a plan. They were children who deserved a life that did not ask them to sacrifice themselves to preserve their mother's lies. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. A steady resolve gathered inside me, not rage. Rage burns too fast. This was colder, clearer, built from truth and necessity. The moment Cassandra and Gregory stepped off that plane, everything would shift. And whether they understood it or not, their children were no longer theirs to break. I opened my eyes, looked toward the sleeping shape on the bed, and understood with absolute certainty what came next. I was going to protect both of them, no matter what it required. I did not sleep the night before they returned. I lay in the chair beside Lila's bed, with the motel curtains drawn halfway closed, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing and the faint hum of cars passing on. The road, outside. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the moment Cassandra and Gregory would walk through that front door in Evanston. Their suitcases are rolling behind them. Their smiles are easy. Their hands are empty. Two people who believed they had left a problem behind and were returning to a future ready to hand them everything they thought they deserved. Just before sunrise, my phone buzzed. A text from the detective. The officers were in place. They were waiting for my signal. By mid-morning, I drove back to Cassandra's house. Lila stayed at Mrs. Bowers with Dylan and a female officer keeping watch. Both children knew something was happening today, but neither asked for details. They had learned too young that adults did not always give answers that made sense. I pulled into the driveway in Evanston just as the airport shuttle van dropped. Cassandra and Gregory at the curb. Their faces looked damp from the sudden shift in weather, still dressed for the Hawaiian heat. Cassandra had on a bright dress and oversized sunglasses. Gregory wore a faded t-shirt and carried a plastic bag of snacks he must have bought in the terminal. Both froze when they saw my car. Cassandra recovered first. She smiled. Bright. Too bright. "Mara, what are you doing here? You should be home." Home. The word tasted wrong coming from her. I stepped out slowly, letting my shoulders slump just enough, my movements slightly strained. I put a hand to my stomach. I said I had been feeling sick since last night. I watched her face when I said it, the subtle flinch she tried to hide, the rise of her eyebrows, the way her smile tightened. Gregory spoke next, a forced laugh. "Probably just something you ate." I met his eyes, held them longer than I usually did. I told him no, it was definitely something I ate. He blinked. Once, twice. I turned toward the front door and unlocked it. I said we needed to talk. Cassandra hesitated, shifting her bag from one shoulder to the other, but she followed me inside. The house felt smaller with them in it again, the silence pressing in from all sides. I walked to the kitchen table and sat down heavily, as if the effort exhausted me. Cassandra lowered herself into the chair across from me. Gregory stayed standing, leaning against the counter, his arms crossed. I placed a single photograph on the table. The first one. The picture I took of the casserole container, the lid scratched near the edges. Cassandra glanced at it. Her smile tightened again. "What is this?" "Just a picture," I said. "A picture of something you prepared for me." Her eyes flicked toward Gregory, then back to me. Her voice softened. "Mara, you look pale. We can talk later. Maybe you should lie down." I placed the second photograph on the table, the smoothie bottle with the loose seal. Gregory exhaled sharply. "What are you implying?" I sat back and let the quiet settle between us. I told them calmly that the food had been sent to a lab, that the results were no longer assumptions. They were facts. Then I said the one word neither was prepared to hear. Ricin. Cassandra's breath stopped. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. Gregory's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, staring at the wall as if it might offer an exit. I reached into my bag and placed the next item on the table. A printed report from the detective. Their internet search history. How to extract ricin. Ricin dosage. How long for ricin to work. Inheritance rules when a sibling dies with no spouse or children. Cassandra shook her head. Tears welled, but they were the wrong shape. No remorse, not a shock. Fear. This is insane, she whispered. Anyone could have searched those things. Gregory might have clicked something by accident. This is being twisted. Gregory pushed off the counter, his voice rising. We did not do anything to you. You are just trying to ruin us because you are jealous. You always have been. You think you are the hero in every situation. I placed the final document on the table. The forged insurance policy. $600,000. My name printed above the signature that did not belong to me. Beneficiary, Cassandra. She stared at it for a long time. Her hands trembled slightly. Then she looked up at me, her voice barely audible. Where did you get that? It was filed using a fake address, I said, but they tracked it. Insurance fraud leaves a trail. She collapsed back in her chair. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just sank as if the bones inside her no longer held shape. Gregory took a step toward her but hesitated, like he did not know whether to touch her or save himself. I kept my voice steady. Why did you think this was the only way? Why me? Cassandra swallowed hard. She whispered something, but the words came out soft. You have everything. You have the house. Mom trusted you. You always land on your feet. I have children to think about. And Gregory owed money. We were drowning. You would not help us. I stared at her. You never asked for help. You decided my life was worth less than your convenience. She tried to speak again, but the words died in her throat. Behind me, a soft creak of the floor made all three of us turn. Lila stood in the doorway. She must have slipped away from the officer outside. Her small hand gripped the doorframe. Her voice was steady, louder than I had ever heard it. Why did you make me lie? The silence that followed was the kind that breaks. Something in the air. Cassandra's eyes filled instantly. Not with motherly grief, but with a crushing weight of being seen by her own child. Lila stepped into the room, her chin trembling, but she did not look away from her mother. You said he would leave if I talked. You said Dylan would be taken away. You said Aunt Mara did not matter because she had no kids. You said I had to pretend I was broken. Gregory moved toward her, but she stepped back. He froze again. I rose from the table and went to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. She leaned into me, not hiding, just anchoring herself. The knock on the door was firm, intentional. Officers stepped inside with the detective behind them. They moved quickly, professionally. They had been listening from outside the entire time. Gregory reacted first. He stepped back, shaking his head, muttering that this was a misunderstanding. But the officers had heard enough. One approached him, recited his rights, and placed handcuffs around his wrists. The metal clicked with a finality that echoed through the quiet kitchen. Cassandra did not move. She sat in the chair with her hands limp in her lap. Her eyes were locked on Lila. When the officer asked her to stand, she looked at me instead. I am her mother, she whispered. I love her. I felt Lila flinch beside me. She pressed closer, her small fingers gripping mine. The officers guided Cassandra to her feet. She did not resist. She walked out of the kitchen slowly, her eyes following her daughter until the doorway blocked her view. The house fell silent again. Not peaceful silence, the heavy kind. The kind that follows truth is finally spoken. Lila took a shaky breath. I knelt in front of her. She rested her forehead against mine, her voice barely audible. Is it over? Not yet, I whispered. But the worst part is. She nodded, trusting me because she had no other choice. I held her hand as the officers escorted her mother and stepfather out the door. When the cars pulled away and the flashing lights disappeared, I stood alone with her in the quiet kitchen that had almost become my grave. The refrigerator hummed softly. The scent of the house was unfamiliar now, like the aftermath of something burning. The truth was out, but the consequences were only beginning. 6 months later, the air inside the house in Skokie felt different. Not lighter, not heavier. Just different in the way a place changes once it has finally been lived in again. I could walk through the hall without flinching at shadows or bracing for a voice raised behind me. The silence now was clean, chosen, safe. I had spent years believing silence meant erasure. Now I understand it could also mean peace. The sentencing took place in early spring. The sky was a faded gray when we walked into the courthouse, the kind of morning that made everything feel sharper. I sat in the second row, with Leela on my left and Dylan on my right. They both held my hands. Their small fingers tightened whenever the judge spoke certain words. Attempted murder. Fraud. Child endangerment. Cassandra stared straight ahead, her shoulders rigid, her gaze fixed on the table as though she could carve an escape hatch into the wood. Gregory blinked repeatedly, as if he could not believe he was hearing his life measured in years. 15 for Cassandra, 12 for Gregory. When it was over, we stepped into the bright March sunlight. Dylan leaned against my side. Lila exhaled a breath she had held for half a year. The wind carried the scent of melting snow, that particular smell of winter letting go. I felt heartbreak and relief at the same time. Both are true. Both are loud. The court appointed me their legal guardian in April. The paperwork filled 2 folders and required 3 hearings. The judge had kind eyes, but she did not soften the reality. She asked careful questions about my work schedule, my home, my finances, my ability to raise 2 children who had survived trauma layered on top of trauma. When she finally said the order was approved, I felt something steady settle in my chest. A role I had stepped into before being asked, now shaped into something formal. We moved into the Skokie house that same week. My parents' house. The house Cassandra had been willing to kill me for. I stood in the doorway that first evening with the keys in my hand and felt gratitude. More than fear. Gratitude that the house had not become a grave for any of us. Gratitude that it could become a home again, even if in a different way than my parents imagined. The kids explored cautiously, as though waiting for something to shatter. They walked down the hall, opening doors, peeking into closets, testing how their voices sounded in new rooms. When they reached the backyard, Dylan stopped at the old tomato bed my mom once tended. He pointed at it silently. I told him we could plant new ones in summer. He nodded, the smallest hint of a smile flickering across his face. His surgery took place in early June. A delicate reconstruction. The surgeon used diagrams and practiced explanations, wanting me to understand each step. I paid for it using part of the inheritance, and by selling a small parcel of land my dad had owned in southern Illinois. The decision came easily. My dad had always believed money was only useful if it helped someone stand on their own feet again. I signed the transfer documents with that in mind. The surgery lasted nearly 5 hours. I spent the entire time in the waiting room pretending to read a magazine without turning a single page. When the surgeon finally walked in, still wearing his blue cap, he smiled beneath his mask and said it went well. Just those 3 words loosened something in me I had not realized was clenched. Dylan woke groggy and silent, but this silence did not frighten him. He squeezed my hand. His eyes were heavy but calm. Healing takes time, the surgeon repeated. Time was something we finally had. On a humid afternoon in July, Dylan stood in the kitchen holding a plastic cup of apple juice. The sunlight hit his hair in thin streaks. Lila sat on the counter, swinging her legs and watching him with anticipation. He took a breath, opened his mouth, and said softly, "Thank you, Aunt Mara." The words were faint but clear, strong enough to pull tears to my eyes before I could hide them. I nodded, swallowing hard, pretending the air was just dry. Leela grinned. Dylan smiled back. A small moment. A monumental one. Lila's recovery came in layers. Her voice grew stronger through therapy sessions with Dr. Hensley. Sometimes she spoke with the soft cadence of a child relearning trust. Other times she talked easily, leaning into laughter she had not allowed herself before. After one session, she told me she was not afraid of her own voice anymore. I nodded, pretending to adjust the rearview mirror to hide the sting in my eyes. In late August, a letter arrived from the correctional facility. My name is written on the envelope in Cassandra's handwriting. I recognized the sharp hooks on the letters. I set it aside for 3 days before opening it. It held 4 paragraphs. Apology, regret, explanations that came too late, acknowledgement of the damage she caused. She said she hoped the kids were safe, She said she did not expect forgiveness. She said prison had forced her to see things she had long refused to acknowledge. I folded the letter twice, then placed it in the drawer of my bedside table. I did not respond. Some stories do not need additional chapters. By early autumn, the yard behind the Skokie house was full of life again. Lila and Dylan played tag near the swing set. Their laughter rose into the late afternoon air, mixing with the rustle of dry leaves. I stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching them. The horizon glowed a warm gold. Shadows stretched long over the grass. For the first time in years, the future did not feel like something that could collapse without warning. Sometimes the ache of what we lost pressed into me. I had lost a sister, not to death, but to choices, to fear, to greed. I had lost the version of my family I carried in childhood memories, the version where love felt uncomplicated. But loss did not hollow me the way I expected. It made room for other things, a home rebuilt with truth instead of fear, a sense of purpose shaped by something steadier than obligation. Dylan ran across the yard and tripped on a patch of uneven dirt. He laughed when he caught himself with one hand. Leela shouted something from the swing, her voice full of joy that did not ask permission from anyone. I breathed in the warm air and let it settle inside me. What we lost mattered, but what we saved mattered more. This story took me a long time to understand, longer to tell. But if you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.